Today on CityCast Pittsburgh, residents are raising a stink about bad smells around the Beaver Cracker plant. Allergies aren't the only issues with our up and down temperatures, and why we think you should hug a tree today. It's the Friday News Roundup, April 28th. I'm Megan Harris, and here's what Pittsburgh's talking about. I'm with CityCast's Mallory Falk and one of our favorite local newsletter writers, Colin Williams from The Incline. Welcome, Colin.
Thanks for having me.
Some dear friends of mine, started The Incline way back when, and our own Hey Pittsburgh writer, Francesca DeBecco, worked there too. We are big fans of your outlet.
Oh, I appreciate that.
What are you most excited to talk to us about today?
So I'm really interested right now in air quality and concerns about pollution because I think that this has just been a fact of life in Pittsburgh for so long. So through the Pittsburgh Media Partnership, I've been part of a collaborative group that's working on kind of approaching the topic of air quality through the lens of misinformation. Or perhaps better said, in some cases, lack of information.
Yeah.
So with these other outlets, we've been looking at basically like what do people know, what don't they know, what's harming people here in the area, and how can we get a better handle on what these large polluters are doing, whether that's through better governance, through personal action, through really just being more aware of the landscape and sharing that knowledge among neighbors and friends.
Yeah, totally. So what don't we know? Tell us. Like, what do we need to know about it?
So I think, one of the big things that's always an indicator of air pollution in Pittsburgh is the sulfur smell. Like if you're familiar with the Smell Pittsburgh app, that's a really good way to get daily information about air quality and to also
scent of Pittsburgh, rotten eggs.
Yes, exactly.
That's it, right? That's the sulfur one, bad eggs.
Exactly.
Okay.
So one of the things that I've actually learned through the course of reporting on this is that smell, while a good indicator of other pollutants, isn't necessarily itself the metric you should use to determine how harmful the pollution is. But it can signal that there are lots of kind of unregulated emissions coming from smokestacks, that maybe a plant is flaring off unwanted gases, or that, as in 2019 with the Clairton Works fire, that the pollution controls simply aren't functioning anymore. So hydrogen sulfide is kind of like the leading indicator of pollution, but there are all these other chemicals.
That is a chemical that floats around in the air.
Yeah.
Let's keep it back to basics, Colin.
So, I guess I'll try and keep this as simple as possible, but there are kind of a couple things to be aware of. And one of the worst things for Pittsburghers' lungs is PM 2.5, which is basically like tiny soot particles in the air.
Okay. So that's like literally when something burns, that gets released?
Yeah. For example, when coal is burned in a low oxygen environment, which is what they do at the Clairton Works, that particle pollution is literally just like coal smoke, basically, coming from the plant. And then, of course, there are other chemicals. You can get these other sulfuric compounds that are very harmful to the lungs. But now with the ethylene cracker plant up in Beaver County that Shell has opened, there's a whole nother range of things to be concerned about, like benzene. There's also the issues of light pollution, of noise pollution. So that pollution doesn't necessarily begin and end with toxic chemicals. There are lots of ways that this can negatively affect lives here in the area.
And we'll get more into that ethane cracker a little later in the show. So glad you brought it up here.
I know you've been reporting with a bunch of local outlets. Your fourth installment just came out. The latest one seems to focus mostly on temperature inversions. Can you explain what that means? I've read about it and I can't get it to cement in my brain.
So the way that I kind of always think about this is our river valleys are sort of like bowls or like gutters that run through our city and carry water and air.
Our valleys are like gutters is like, it should be a new tourism slogan.
You'll pitch that to Visit Pittsburgh. But so what can happen when the temperature drops is that the cold air from the atmosphere kind of settles over top of these valleys and sort of puts a lid on things. So you'll have a situation where the air is moving, let's say, from west to east, as often our weather patterns do, like rain often comes to us from Ohio. But while that happens, there's this like seal over top of the valley. So you can kind of picture like if you saran wrapped over the Mon, all the pollution that's made by polluters who are further down in the valley, like Clairton, that stuff can just flow up the river valley and into the city. And so when you see these spikes in reports on Smell Pittsburgh and things like that, it's usually the result of a temperature inversion that is basically creating a pathway where air can actually move in different directions from the prevailing weather patterns. And this stuff just kind of floats up through Squirrel Hill, over into Highland Park, and throughout the rest of the city. And you can sometimes even tell from Smell Pittsburgh which direction these inversion currents are moving, because the reports may come from further south, or they may be more in the East End. So you can kind of see sort of the geography of it a little bit.
Interesting.
So what actually creates these inversions? Like, is this somebody's fault that they happen?
It's just a natural phenomenon. I think climate change, may exacerbate kind of how this happens, depending on how quickly, how fast the wind is or whatever. But in general, it's a natural phenomenon that just kind of, for better or worse, plays havoc with what local people are doing. And so when you have these polluters and an inversion happens, the county's been working on trying to put rules in place to make sure that there are fewer emissions during those times. But that's a whole nother can of worms, really.
Can we tell when it's going to happen? Like, can you kind of like gauge that, or like try to put in precautions? Like, does it have to do with up and down temperatures or anything like that?
So I'm obviously not a meteorologist.
Of course.
But the quick drops in temperatures can often lead to those inversions. I mean, I noticed in mid-April there was about a week-long spate of really bad air quality days. And on all of those days, it was bright and sunny. It would be the high temperature was like in the mid-60s, and then at night it would drop toward near freezing. Mm-hmm. And so with those like rapid swings in temperature, the warm air that's in the river valleys basically gets trapped. Like, it doesn't have time to kind of get forced out. So that's when that lid effect really happens over the city.
So are these inversions always harmful?
I wouldn't say they're always harmful, because it really just comes down to how much pollution is present at those times.
Oh.
Like, if you had polluters stopping polluting before an inversion, which is what the county's air quality rules have attempted to enforce, it would be a lot less harmful. The issue is when you have a high quality of pollution and then you have that inversion, that you can create a scenario kind of like the Donora smog disaster, where you're basically just containing all of the pollutants in a given area. And if there's not enough wind to flush those out, then people are just going to be breathing that in for hours.
I was shocked by your story and just how many days we experience with inversions. It was like nearly half the year.
It's quite a lot. I mean, our topography has some really good advantages, like the beautiful views that we get to enjoy all the time in the city. But it does create some problems when it comes to these weather patterns. And one of the things that, has kind of come to my attention or through reporting on this is that, if it weren't for modern meteorology, we would maybe still be just heavily polluting and having the steel industry and perhaps not understanding fully the health effects. And I wonder, if people had known about inversions, if this would have become the steel center that it did. But with the natural resources we had and the, relative lack of sophistication around knowledge of weather in the 1800s, people were just like, oh, yeah, this is where we're going to do it.
Yeah. Oh, and just to clarify for folks, if you're not familiar with Donora smog, that was in 1948. It was right after World War II. I know, I'm sure about that, where a lot of people died because smog got trapped in Donora, Pennsylvania. Definitely worth a Google if you're not familiar with what happened.
Yeah, and there's a museum in Donora actually that they're going to be doing a commemoration, and they're doing like a day at the museum where they'll have talks and things like that if you're interested in learning more.
So can, non-meteorologists, just regular people, track these kinds of things or do anything to help?
Well, you can monitor the air. You can close your windows at night. You can look at the air quality index before you decide to do outdoor activities. There are an increasing number of places where you can get real-time information on air quality. So I often will just open Smell Pittsburgh and see what the county's air quality monitors are saying about the particulate level in my area. But increasingly, people are also getting their own monitors. There's this company, Purple Air, that makes basically monitors for like civilian use, if you can call it that. And they have a map that's consistently updated with the real air quality. So you can tell like every 15 minutes whether the air quality is improving or worsening. Now, having said all this, that's not a preventative measure. And so I think there's relatively little that we as Pittsburghers can do to prevent these things. So, Yeah, it is. You're always kind of more in a reactive rather than a proactive situation, unless you are these companies who are polluting or the regulators who are overseeing them.
Yeah, I was just glancing at my iPhone. It does have an air quality thing at the bottom, which I've glanced at before, and it'll send me an alert from time to time, but I've probably not been as diligent about checking that as I could be as a Pittsburgher.
So is there any more reporting coming on this, even if it is a little deflating to learn that the more you learn, there's not necessarily immediate action you can take beyond closing your bedroom windows? But if we want to learn more about this and follow any developments, is there more coming?
I can't believe closing your bedroom window is like the advice we get.
Yeah, and
this
it's such
the
a
year of
bummer,
our Lord
too.
of 2023. Close your bedroom window.
I mean, when it's like, between 50 and 60 degrees, that's also like the perfect temperature to have your windows open. But that can mean if the temperatures are dropping that you might be playing with fire on that stuff. But as far as the further reporting, though, I'm really excited about what's going to be coming out to kind of round out this project. So we've had 4 pieces published that approach it from these different angles. So mine was more focused on grassroots science. City Paper, as I mentioned, did the meteorology. Union Progress covered how air quality monitoring is used with fracking. And we're going to have some more reporting coming out from the Allegheny Front on the radio about Shell specifically. We have some tentative plans for a coverage of the Donora smog disaster anniversary through the Mon Valley Independent. And there may actually be some other stories that come through this as well. I know the Pittsburgh Independent has continued to follow leads about what county elected officials are saying. And we've had some interest from folks like Environmental Health News in further amplifying this work and potentially contributing as well.
So speaking of air quality, some of our listeners might remember an episode we did last year about a new Shell plant that was opening in Beaver County, the ethane cracker that you mentioned, Colin. It's a cracker plant, which to me at first sounded like it would be pumping out saltines or something. But
every major story in town at first was, what is a cracker?
Exactly. I think including us. But yeah, it's actually making plastic out of ethane. Even before it opened, environmental groups and some residents were concerned about the air pollution it might cause. Friend of the pod, Reed Frazier from the Allegheny Front, talked to some families who had left Beaver County or were considering moving because of those concerns. So I've got an update on this story. Colin, I was going to ask if you were familiar with this plant, but clearly you are, as you've been following pollution and air inversions.
Yeah, I had a chance to talk to a couple different environmental groups about the cracker plant specifically. So I spoke with Eyes on Shell and BC-MAC, which is the Beaver County Marcellus Awareness Community. And I think one big difference with the cracker plant is that people have been following this from before the cornerstone was even laid.
100%. Because it's also right by a major trail system that people use like crazy. There was a big construction project with a bridge just close to it. Plus, it's across the river from a really thriving community. So people have been watching this thing for a while.
One of the things that was pointed out to me that is a little bit scary is that beyond just any of the air quality concerns or water quality concerns, because I know there have been locals monitoring whether there are plastic pellets floating down the Ohio and that kind of thing.
Yeah, Reed talked a lot about that.
The nurdles.
The nurdles.
Yes.
The nurdles.
Beware the nurdles. But the cracker plant is also built on a brownfield site. There was a lead and zinc smelter there previously. And in order to remediate the brownfield site, they covered it in 8 feet of topsoil and then built the cracker plant on top of it. So Bob Schmetzer from BC-MAC expressed to me a very strong concern that should something happen with the pipelines going into the cracker plant, it's a 24-inch wide compressed natural gas line. Should the earth underneath the plant settle, it could cause a pipeline crack, potentially creating the circumstances for an explosion.
Oh my God, Colin, you're making this a lot darker than I thought it was going to be.
Well, and there's also rail infrastructure immediately next to it. There's a BASF chemical plant there. So his words were, "We live in a very dangerous area," and I really took that to heart. And now this East Palestine disaster has also just made me very aware of all the rail infrastructure we have here in Pittsburgh. So
Absolutely.
This is where regulation, I think, is going to be really important in the future.
Yeah, this seems like something that shutting your bedroom window isn't going to protect you from.
We've moved on now.
But I'm bringing up the plant now because this week on Tuesday, Shell just had its first public meeting with the community since the plant opened in November. And what triggered this was that earlier earlier this month, I guess there was a really bad smell coming from the plant. Residents understandably freaked out about that. The state's investigating, and that led Shell to hold this virtual meeting.
I remember seeing headlines about the smell. Did they ever figure out or say what it was?
Yeah, before I get into what the smell actually was, I just, there's been some great reporting on this, both from Reed Frazier at Allegheny Front and also Christy Suttles with the Beaver County Times. And I was just really struck by the way people described this smell. So some people told Reed it smelled like burning gas and maple syrup mixed together. And one woman said it was like someone came in her backyard and just doused it with gasoline. And then another woman told Chrissy that it smells like if you burned rotten potatoes, but used garage chemicals to do it. And people reported getting headaches, feeling nauseous, having burning or watery eyes. So people were unsettled. And yeah, like you wanted to know what the smell was.
So the public meeting, did they clarify anyone's concerns? Or I guess, I assume it wasn't actually potatoes.
It was not potatoes being burned with garage chemicals. Yeah. So Shell's message essentially has been that there was an incident that caused these smells, and they apologize for any inconvenience it may have caused, but the community is safe. So they say crews were
Are they, though?
Well, we'll get into that. But first, here's what Shell shared. They said crews were draining a tank to get ready for some scheduled maintenance, and that it led to this release of hydrocarbons, or like an oily water mixture, that caused the smell. Shell has air monitors at the plant, and they detected higher than normal levels of volatile organic compounds after this incident. These are like various chemicals that include benzene, like you mentioned before, Colin, which is a known carcinogen. But Shell says the levels didn't exceed federal limits. They brought in this senior toxicologist from an environmental consulting firm, which, by the way, the PG reports is the same environmental consulting firm that responded after the train derailment in East Palestine.
Oh, gosh.
Yeah.
Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
Well, I did find a ProPublica article that said this company has been accused of repeatedly downplaying health risks. So there's that. But yeah, this toxicologist said that the levels of benzene detected at the fence line of the plant were too low to cause, quote, even transient discomfort or irritation. And he said that the odors themselves might have caused these feelings of nausea and headaches as opposed to the chemicals. He also said that, that odors can alert people to the presence of an airborne chemical, but it doesn't necessarily mean that like a harmful amount of that chemical is present in the air.
That's interesting to hear, because one of the things that I heard kind of looking more deeply into the East Palestine thing is that at the concentrations that people were smelling chlorine, it was extremely harmful. Like if it reached that level of like, you can smell it, it's not good for you. I don't know. I mean, obviously that we're talking about very different chemicals here,
right.
Polyvinyl chloride versus ethane and ethylene. But yeah, I would not feel terribly reassured by that information.
Yeah.
I don't think.
Well, and especially that it's coming after the fact and after a lot of advocacy to get them to speak on it. Like these smells happened a long time ago. There's also been other complaints about flares and like colors in the sky and things changing and not getting a lot of response out of Shell. So I can see how maybe folks are not feeling great about it. I don't know. I'm assuming that you've done a little bit more research as to what folks have actually said after the fact.
Yeah. So, Christy Suttles with the Beaver County Times talked to this guy named Clifford Lau. He's a chemist and he volunteers with Eyes on Shell, the watchdog group you mentioned, Colin. And he agreed that like the benzene levels probably weren't high enough to have caused these symptoms. But he said what he's actually more worried about is the, potential long-term impacts of just these regular, like low-level exposures to chemicals like benzene.
I feel like I remember Reed talking about this some.
Exactly. Well, he told us that when he came on the show, he told us that the Shell plant is permitted to be the second biggest emitter of volatile organic compounds in Pennsylvania. It's by far the biggest one in our region. The way Lau described it was that the plant's causing people to live in a chemical soup.
Oh, that's gross.
And so there's just like, the levels are going up and down, but regardless, there's kind of this constant exposure to these chemicals. And, that has him and other community members worried. And I think it's also just important to point out that this isn't like the first incident or issue since the ethane cracker opened, right? Like not the first time we've had these smells. The Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection has issued like numerous notices of violation against Shell for things like exceeding pollution limits and visible emissions from flaring or burning off excess gases. I've heard it described as looking like the sky is on fire.
Yeah, I've seen photos. My brother-in-law lives really close to there, and he can see it from his place in Rochester.
Yeah.
And I talked to some folks who said that they live, 3 miles away, and they can still sometimes see it from their house at night.
Yeah,
Yeah.
when we were watching fireworks last year, the plant wasn't even operational yet, and we could still see like the glow of it. It really puts a different feeling on the 4th of July. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, it feels kind of like nuclear wastelandy a little bit.
Yeah.
That, there was a flaring incident as recently as March after an equipment malfunction. And the plant hasn't even been open for 6 months at this point. So this just is not the most reassuring track record to already have this many violations in less than half a year.
Totally. So I guess what happens now that they've had this meeting?
Yeah, so the Shell plant is, currently shut down for maintenance. Shell hasn't said when it will reopen, but they said they'll post an update on Facebook. It seems like Facebook is kind of the main way that they communicate. And they said they'll let people know in advance because there's going to be more flaring when it reopens. And then I know back in February, a couple environmental groups announced their plan to sue Shell to try to get it to comply with state and federal air rules. So, still kind of looking to see where that suit goes, but it does not sound like all the questions and concerns of Beaver County residents have been addressed.
That's certainly not the impression that I got doing my reporting. And I would say one other thing that's really interesting with Beaver County is that as Pittsburghers, we're used to a lot of county oversight. There's a county health department. There are local regulations about what these plants can and cannot do. In Beaver County, the situation's much different because they don't have a health department at all.
Yeah.
They also have, as in many areas of Pennsylvania, lots of small municipalities with local control. And so you have individual townships who are in some cases making decisions on what this multinational oil company is able to do within the county. And then when it's time for things like more oversight, there's really nobody outside of the state and the feds to provide that. And so I think in the case of Shell, what we're seeing is that there's been a lot more activism on the community level, in part because I feel like folks are just filling a vacuum.
Mm-hmm.
There aren't these local regulatory authorities. And so people have had to kind of take matters into their own hands.
And finally, it is almost Arbor Day. We have a ton of green space in Pittsburgh, but our tree canopy apparently is not as good as it could be. Colin, we were talking a little bit off mic about your new addition. Tell us about that new arrival.
Yeah, we got a baby crabapple in front of our house.
A new tree.
A new tree. And so Pittsburgh, I'm so happy we get to talk about something that is, really a sign of Pittsburgh rejuvenating itself and getting greener. But one thing that locals may not know is that getting a tree in front of your house is actually free.
Mm-hmm.
So the city Shade Tree Commission, I actually snail mailed them a request form for a tree,
of you. Yeah,
which felt very
You killed
quaint.
a tree to request a tree.
So we had a linden tree in front of our house that was just rotting away. The city came and cut it down in the span of an hour about 6 months after I put in my request. And then a month later, they came in, they cut up the sidewalk, and now we have a little crabapple tree. So the process took a little while, but we literally had to do nothing except send a letter, and now we just get to admire our lovely new tree.
Did you get to choose the tree?
They actually choose for you based on what is most helpful for the local canopy. So the Shade Tree Commission came by and kind of did an evaluation of our neighborhood and determined that the crabapple would be the best fit. We've seen them put in a couple other trees in the neighborhood. I think they put in some cherries and some other nice flowering species. But one thing that they do, which is really nice, is they make sure that the trees they put in are utility friendly. So when our little baby crabapple grows up, it won't get tangled in the power lines like our linden did. And then you don't get these weird trees with like their arms all akimbo to avoid the power lines.
Totally. We talked to the executive director of Tree Pittsburgh, Danielle Crumrine, last year, and she was talking all about that, like how, just the way that they go about making those decisions has changed radically in the last 10 to 15 years. Before, it was people got to kind of request their own, or, you'd say like, oh, a maple might look nice here, but that's not how they make choices anymore, which seems like a really cool evolution in that space.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about all the maples in Pittsburgh that are pushing up sidewalk blocks, I think it's pretty clear why they shifted away from that. So I'm glad both that we have a tree back, which will provide some shade and some privacy, but I'm also glad that they got us a tree that isn't going to destroy our sidewalk or, push roots up into the garden or anything like that.
So the canopy, of course, is responsible for a bunch of cool things like shade, wind control, water erosion, noise buffering, which I think a lot of us forget about, and then, of course, pollution cleansing. It's interesting to kind of dig into some of the data that the city's put together over the years.
Yeah. And I mean, I know Tree Pittsburgh mapped out our canopies a decade ago, but is there any new data about the tree canopy here?
I think we're supposed to get some soon. I remember Danielle told us last year that they were due for something fresh. Colin, do you want to take a guess which neighborhoods, as of that old data, of course, have the highest percentage of tree cover?
Well, number one has got to be Hayes because that neighborhood is mostly forest.
I am shocked. I was going to give you points if you got anything in the top 10. With 90
Did I get it
neighborhoods.
right?
You did.
You nailed it right out the gate.
82% of Hayes is entirely tree.
Which, by the way, I cannot
tree
wait
covered.
for that to become a park. I did a little hiking in Hayes Woods. I'm not sure if that's legal, so if it isn't, that's satire. But
If you saw Colin, no, you didn't.
It has potential to be a really beautiful park. Beyond Hayes, I would say probably Squirrel Hill has a ton of tree cover because they've got the parks.
Not in the top 10, but I think that's a good guess.
Oh, interesting. And then, what else would have the most trees? Highland Park has a lot of trees.
Also not the top 10.
Man.
I know, none of the parks. Isn't that interesting?
Oh, my goodness.
So Glen Hazel, very close, 81%, a close second. St. Clair has 69%. New Homestead, which I don't think I realized was a distinction, is 67%. And then Perry North is 64%, repping the north side. And then coming in, the next five are Spring Garden, Regent Square, Ridgemont, Arlington Heights, and Oakwood. A lot of neighborhoods we do not say the names of all that often.
Yeah, I think actually, thinking about that list, the top 5 in some cases have had public housing projects that were demolished and have left behind largely urban prairie and forest. St. Clair, I think, is, if I'm not mistaken, is home to one of the city's biggest urban farms.
Yeah, absolutely. And then Perry North, of course, still has a housing project, but it's good to see that at least the green space has been preserved to a degree. So are y'all doing anything to celebrate Arbor Day today?
I will probably just enjoy some time outside. Take maybe high five my crabapple on my way back. Yeah, good day to hug a tree.
I might actually celebrate by requesting a tree. There is no tree in front of, I just moved into a new house with no tree.
Congrats.
So thank you. So maybe that'll be the way that I celebrate, by trying to get my own personal baby crabapple.
I love that.
Yay.
Well, if you do want to celebrate in public, there's an Arbor Day celebration on Saturday from 11 a.m. to 2 p.m. Tree Pittsburgh is involved. There'll be tree care and green space lessons, plus activities and games and food trucks and live music. It's all at Mellon Park in Shadyside.
And also, you should definitely check out our episode with Danielle from Tree Pittsburgh, which went into how to get a tree planted, what species they recommend for different areas. Sounds like maple is off the list.
I think it's just in particular places, right?
Gotcha. And also what our local lawmakers could do to help homeowners make their properties a lot nicer.
It was a very good one. We'll have a link in our show notes, plus all of Colin's great work as well. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Really appreciate the invite. Great talking to you guys.
That's all for today here on CityCast Pittsburgh. Our music is by Benji. Mallory Falk is our lead producer. Special help this week from Natalie Rivera, Lizzie Goldsmith, and Noah Snyderman. Our newsletter editor is Francesca DeBecco, and I'm your host, Megan Harris. We'll be back on Monday with more news from around the city. Have a good weekend, Yins.
I lived in the Southwest where you couldn't see a tree if your life depended on it. So maybe my data's a little skewed.